And welcome to the Jameel Rawls Show. And what I want to be going over with my audience is psychology. And over the years, I've studied psychology in depth. Traditionally, I would study Princeton psychology. And Princeton psychology in the 1950s and 1960s was one of the most fascinating psychology departments in the country. They used to have a protocol with their students where you could get up during a test, walk around the room, smoke cigarettes, talk to people, do whatever you wanted to do. The only thing was you were held on your own merit. You were expected to be moral, and you were expected to be honest, and you were expected not to cheat. So that was my introduction into psychology. I would look at many videos of the mice experiments at Yale that were done back in the 30s. Eventually, studying psychology caught me up to parapsychology, which is one of my most fascinating studies that I do. But okay, I want to start out with a more recent psychologist that's pretty well known, named Steven Pinker. And Steven Pinker was going over brain interpretations and core intuitions. Brain interpretations and core intuitions. Now, Steven Pinker also was into intuitive physics. Another fascinating subject was the biology of psychology, meaning your physical environment around you. I started getting into the medical field around the same time I started studying psychology. And what I realized is you have the cranial nerves. And within the cranial nerves, you have about 12 nerves. And within those 12 nerves, they're responsible for the process of sensory information. What you're seeing, what you're smelling, the activity, and around those 12 cranial nerves, you have the gray brain matter, which absorbs a lot of the energy, right? This is in your brainstem, it's connected to all this. So your sensory functions rely on the relationship with your mental attitude and the physical features around you, such as shape psychology, color perception, then dealing with the brain waves, the alpha, beta, delta, theta, and gamma, which an alpha wave, can put you in more of a sleep-like state. If you're in a waking state, you have a delta wave, you may be more prone to depression. Theta wave is known to keep people in a very intuitive sort of focus. ESP psychics are known to use the theta wave primarily. Beta makes people more concentrated and more focused. So studying psychology really excited me for years. Carl Jung, wonderful psychologist. Also an esoteric researcher like myself. Now let me get some notes. What was Carl Jung? He used to study the shadow mind, and this was one of the most brilliant psychological studies I undertook because it gets you to deal with repression and what's been hidden. Ego. Now, the ego, the unconscious, and the environment. So you have the ego, then you have the unconscious, then you have the environment around you, the physical environment, the people you interact with, and it's all connected. Now, through my study of parapsychology, I started coming up with some really interesting perceptions of awareness. One of them I recently came up with is called "What Are You Channeling?", where I explain to people you're always channeling. Channeling is what an intuitive does. When they connect through a psychic signal known as the tachyon particle, or recently from the 1960s, the metaparticle, and psychically they connect to their environment around them and they absorb information in. That's what a channeler does. Like when somebody goes into church and through a religious practice and they pray to God and they claim, oh, I prayed and 2 weeks later, God gave me some information. Well, a channeler says, I went into a meditative state and connected with a spirit or some metaphysical construction and got the information instantly. It's about the same thing as being in a church, just a little bit different. Now, Carl Jung talked about the absolute evil and going up against all these different parts of yourself. And so when I was studying when I was breaking down my perception of what are you channeling, if you're watching a television show and there's a lot of violence and there's a lot of simulated death going on, that's going to get into your psyche. And when you go out into the world, you're going to view people as your interpretation of what you've been watching through the film. That's channeling. You're channeling the information through the film. Same thing with music. You're channeling the information. Same thing talking to somebody walking down the streets. You're channeling this information. So this is environmental psychology. Again, dealing with colors, noise, people. Like, I sit down and have a conversation with a group of people. How do I feel about these people in my environment? I'm going to take that back out into the world with me. So now let me go a little bit deeper. And parapsychology is where real psychologists, really good psychologists, ultimately become parapsychologists. So brain waves change to fit environment, dealing with psychology. Hey, if there's people around you that you get along with beautifully, you're usually going to have a good interpretation of reality. And your environment changes your performance. Stimuli, environmental stimuli. Now, that's one of the things I learned from studying psychology, formally studying some of these professors at these major colleges, like Cornell and whatnot, is you can be overstimulated or understimulated. And they would have experimentations with chimpanzees. And they would see how chimpanzees would get along with each other in a group-like setting. And this gets into adaptation. So, now anyway, humans, when you study humans and you study formal psychology, like experimental psychology, you can see how people continuously make excuses for their life. People will minimize, rationalize, maximize, justify. You can look at criminology. You can look at forensic psychology and criminology, and you can learn a lot. You can learn a lot on psychology just by listening to homicide detectives. The research they've done, they deal with people in a psychological setting every day. You have correctional psychology, which is becoming a permanent class with itself, where psychologists go into a correctional facility, a prison, a penitentiary, and they give psychological advice to the inmates who greatly need it, right? So correctional psychology is something that modern psychology is really starting to take a look at. It's getting exciting. You got psychologists who can sit there, work with people who are vulnerable, people who may have a drug addiction, people who may have a mental illness, and they can give them advice and learn from them. The prison is a wonderful setting for that. So that's one of the things modern psychology has been coming up with. Now, Harvard psychology, I can sit there and listen to Harvard psychology forever. I can sit there and listen to Harvard law forever. My favorite thing to do is to sit there and listen to Harvard lectures, psychologists, lawmakers, some of the famous judges we've had the pleasure to have over the years in the United States. I like creating my own formula of psychology. Primarily, I'm into studying stuff like telekinesis. Formally, I'm a conspiracy researcher. That's how I got into psychological and parapsychology. But if it was up to me, I'd be studying stuff like telekinesis, which nobody really talks about. But there's a lot of different interesting... Oh, schizophrenia. Schizophrenia actually means the split of the mind. And this terminology came out around 1908. Personality, thinking, memory, perception, effects of cognitive functions. The thing about schizophrenia is there is no proof for schizophrenia. You can take somebody. They say somebody could just be a little bit different, and they could be diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic. Schizophrenia really doesn't mean anything. There's a lot of new doctors coming along in today's world, and they're having issues with medical diagnoses. They're having issues diagnosing new patients with mental illnesses because they're realizing everybody's different. And there really is no basis just to do a magical wand and say, hey, you got this, hey, you got that. Go take, Now, the 5 points of psychology that I researched and that I've self-created on my platform: psychological health, intellectual health, emotional health, behavioral health, spiritual health, where I deal with individual interaction, social interaction, environmental interaction. Now, I do this on a psychological basis, but primarily my research, again, goes into parapsychology. How does this affect the world around me metaphysically? And a lot of magicians are along those lines. A lot of people who study ceremonial magic and formal magic, they sort of get into that kind of stuff. But I'm not a ceremonial magician, but I am a parapsychologist. And that deals with adaptation versus adjustment to an environment. Then you have things like signal detection theory, strength of signal, sensory adaptation. So I can train my senses through motory function to interpret my environment around me. Now, those who have formal study psychology or parapsychology, you get like the studies of brain waves, the oscilloscope, the electroencephalograph. This stuff is really cool. The Jameel Rawls show got some interesting stuff. You get educational psychology, which you can go over poor learning and good learning, versus classical psychology. Post-traumatic stress disorder, that's an interesting topic for psychologists. Studying the Vietnam era, there's a documentary called Vietnam Junkies, and it shows the people coming back from the Vietnam War, and there would be men who, they had killed 12-year-olds, literally, and it really bothered them, and they had to go to methadone. They got addicted to heroin, and they had to go to methadone clinics, and a lot of them were pro-violent, they were prone to violence from the mental injuries they suffered during the battles in Vietnam. And I have relatives who've been in the Vietnam War. So sitting back and watching psychologists talk to Vietnam vets, that taught me a lot about the suffering and the pain people go through when they don't have the proper conceptualization of their environment. So this is sort of something for people who are interested in self-help or interested in getting into the research of psychology. And of course, you can get yourself a medical dictionary. There's like a dictionary that has psychological definitions. But Harvard psychologists, and it's not just Harvard, Oxford psychology is one of the best. I believe Oxford psychology has some spectacular leadership leaders over the years. I've got to sit down and watch, debates, not online, not in person, but I've got to sit down and watch debates in the psychiatric field and the psychological, psychiatric as well, psychological field, and sit there and listen to these guys. And what they're saying is really interesting. They're basically speaking of perception of reality. They use, lingo, psychological lingo or whatever, but they're talking about perception of reality. That's what it boils down to. And you got experimental psychology, like we were talking about, which is basically a sub-discipline of psychology. Again, sensation, perception, memory, cognition, learning, motivation, emotion, developmental processes, social psychology, neural substances. And then again, neuroplasticity. When you're talking about the neurons in the brain, you're talking about neuroplasticity. And that's an interesting subject, because if you really want to get your mind into a condition, into a certain way of thinking, it only takes 15 minutes to do it. You sit there for 15 minutes. I tell people to meditate. Meditate on something you want to be achieving, or meditating on something you want to meditate on something you want to comprehend for 15 minutes. And the neuroplasticity in your brain, the neurons, will adjust themselves to that. That's real. And there's been some really interesting studies in the medical field. There's been people who were considered multiple personality characters. And in reality, you only have one personality, but it can be fractioned off into multiple versions like a pie. And there's been people who have had one color eye, and then they go to a different personality, and their eye color changes. There's been people who've had diseases, and they go to a different personality, and they no longer have the disease at all. There's been some very fascinating discoveries in psychology. Another good discovery is a book called The Heart's Code. Heart's Code. I forget Paul Purcell or something. I forget the name. But this man wrote a book called The Heart's Code where he dictated to the audience, the readers, how a heart transplant can change somebody's preference of food. If I have a heart transplant, the donor's preference for Mexican food might become my preference. There's been cases where a woman had a transplant from a married woman who had a transplant from a prostitute, and her sexual likings changed. Her sexual cravings changed based on the transplant. And it's called The Heart's Code, and it talks about the heart is far more powerful than the brain. It's a good book. Then another thing about psychology, when it comes to now forensic psychology was really interesting to me, listening to homicide investigators, different sorts of people over the years. And I came into a study of hypnosis investigations, where people are put under hypnosis, almost a step ahead, almost like truth serum, which is sodium pentothal. There's a sodium pentothal is a drug they would give people to get the truth out of it, right? And a hypnosis investigation is very similar to it. And that's what I do. That's what I do. I've been. Then you have the perception. You know, when it comes to international psychiatry, what we talk about is that there's deviance in one culture, and it might not be deviance in another culture. And I think I talked about that in another video I made on my perception between Western philosophy and Eastern philosophy, that in some areas of the world, suicide is looked upon as being honorable, such with the kamikaze or the samurai with the harikari or whatever. They looked at that as being suicide as being honorable. In the West, it's looked at as a horrible thing. So in psychiatry, you can look at deviance. Suicide, in some cases, may not be deviant in this culture, but is deviant in that culture. So psychology changes based upon culture. And this is opposed to a mental disorder versus mood disorder. There's a difference between a mood disorder and a mental disorder, a big difference. How long have I been going? And getting back to the sensory functions of the brain, we're talking about the cranial nerves, specific adaptation, circuitry of the brain. All neurons are spontaneously active. It gets into dreaming. What are dreams? Now, dreams are some of the most fascinating things I've ever seen. Like, there was a movie that was one of my favorites called Nightmare on Elm Street. And it dealt with Nancy and the dream clinic. And I broke it down. Robert Englund was one of my favorite actors. He played on the show V. Robert Englund. He went to college in Detroit. He's a very interesting guy. His horror movies are spectacular. And there's a lot of lessons to be learned studying the Nightmare on Elm Street series. But Nancy went to the dream clinic, and she pulled Freddy's hat out. Freddy Krueger's hat out, and they were like, "How did she do that? How did she do that?" And getting into dreams is, there's something deeply paranormal about the mind and dreams. I got these notes mixed up with microelectronical notes. I was studying the Cold War a while back, and microelectronics played a part in that during the 80s, 70s, 80s. I got my notes a little mixed up, so I got to go through them a little bit faster. But parapsychology is one of the parapsychology I think is one of the coolest studies in the world. I can go off that just thinking about it. There's all sorts of fascinating material in parapsychology. I think one of my first interests came in through the movie Poltergeist, where I realized a haunting and a poltergeist is two different things. A poltergeist is something that follows somebody versus a haunting is a certain location. In today's world, they got EVP'S, where they can hear people talking, they don't know where it's coming from. And that's very fascinating, because some people are saying, are these different dimensions, or are they really ghosts, but there's scientific evidence for it. So this gets a little bit into quantum computers, quantum functions, where quantum computers are able to have a perception of parallel dimensions. And that's something that's very exciting. So the world's perception of what paranormal is or isn't is changing. Instead of these just being ghosts that are haunting your house, these may be people in different, this may be activity in a different dimension, per se. So the subject open for debate. So that's the Jameel Rawls show. And what else am I? Oh, look at this. Isn't this interesting? Look what I got, a Deutschmark. That's real German money. This is what I'm about to show you. Because I enjoy heavily studying financing and banking, world governments and whatnot. This is real German money before the European Union. If you go to Germany, it's hard to get. Then if you can get your hands on some Reichsmarks, you might be rich. That's real German money. Look at that old guy with the Phrygian cap, isn't that cool? Germans were heavy into psychology. Still are. Yeah, Carl Jung was German. Deutsche Bank. I love studying Germany. I love studying the German culture. I like to carry this around for good luck. German money. All right, but welcome to this is now where it came through the Jameel Rawls show. And then I appreciate everybody for subscribing to my channel. I hope I was able to say something today that was able to help you. You could research and connect back to what I was, some of the references I gave. Parapsychology, again, you can get into what I love. I love retrocognition, the ability to learn of the past through perception, through looking at objects, pictures, hearing stories, or whatever of the past. Retrocognition is discovery of that. Precognition is discovery of the future. Okay? So you have those two. That's one of my favorite researches. But, all right. The old man. Okay, thank you and subscribe, and I look forward to hearing from my subscribers.